My dead husband's family took everything from me and left my children and I to our fate. Then I met him. My name is Abina Danso, a devoted wife, a mother of two, and a woman who believed in family until the day they buried my husband. What followed wasn't grief, it was betrayal. My husband's family took everything, the house, the money, even my children's future. Left with nothing but heartbreak and two small hands to hold, I vanished quietly. But what they didn't know was, while they celebrated my downfall, I was building something stronger. And now, I'm back. Not to beg, not to plead, but to reclaim everything they stole one piece at a time. Before we dive into my story, I'd like you to support us by subscribing to our channel and hit the notification button so you don't miss any of our stories like this. Tell us where you're watching from. We might give you a shout out in our next video. Now, let's begin. I still remember the chill in the air that morning. Not from the wind, but from the way their eyes watched me, as if I didn't belong. My husband's coffin hadn't even been lowered into the ground yet, and already I could feel the change. His mother clutched her purse tightly, not because it brought her comfort, but because it held keys to something I would soon realize I no longer had access to: our home, our savings, and our dignity. My children, Michaela and Josiah, stood beside me, holding my hands, their eyes confused. They didn't understand why their grandmother wouldn't meet their gaze, or why their uncles whispered among themselves like we were strangers who had overstayed a welcome. I had married into the Nyarko family with nothing but love and hope in my heart. Kwame, my late husband, had been my rock, my protector, my calm in the middle of every storm. He'd always said, "If anything ever happens to me, I've made sure you and the kids are protected." I believed him. We never had wealth beyond measure, but he had been careful, responsible, always planning for tomorrow. Or so I thought. Because the moment the final prayer ended and the mourners scattered like leaves, his mother, Evelyn, approached me with a look I'll never forget. "You need to vacate the house by next week," she said, cold and unwavering. "Kwame built that house on Nyarko land. It belongs to the family, not you." I stood frozen, my heart pounding like a war drum. I thought it was grief clouding my ears. But she meant it. Her sons flanked her like guards, as if I were a threat. I looked around, searching for anyone who might speak up for me. But all I found were bowed heads and silence. One by one, they left, and with each footstep fading into the distance, a piece of my life unraveled. Back at the house, the one I thought was ours, I packed in silence. Evelyn had already changed the locks once, claiming it was for security, and only gave me access under her supervision. She took Kwame's documents, his clothes, even the children's photo albums, saying they were family history and didn't belong to me. I should have fought then, screamed, refused. But I had two grieving children to care for and nowhere else to go. In 3 days, I found myself and the kids huddled inside a rented single-room apartment that smelled of mold and old tears. Michaela coughed the whole first night, and Josiah wet the mattress, something he hadn't done since he was 5. I held them close, whispered promises I wasn't sure I could keep, and cried when they finally drifted to sleep. I was broken. The woman I had been, Kwame's wife, a teacher, a nurturer, she had no place in this version of my life. I had become something else entirely. A ghost no one saw, a burden no one wanted. I tried to contact the lawyer Kwame used to speak of, but his office was no longer operational. When I went to the bank, I was told that the joint account we shared had been drained 3 days after Kwame's death by an authorized family representative. I asked to see the documents. They said it was his mother. I couldn't even feel anger, just the slow, crushing weight of betrayal. She hadn't waited a week. She hadn't waited a single breath after he passed. She had planned this. And what hurt the most was the silence of everyone who knew. Friends from church, old neighbors, even Kwame's cousins who used to joke with us at family gatherings, they all disappeared. No one wanted to get in the middle. No one wanted to risk being outcast by the powerful Nyarko name. My job didn't pay enough, so I took a second one cleaning offices at night. Every day I rose before dawn to prepare the kids for school, then taught restless students until afternoon, only to scrub marble floors and empty trash cans till midnight. I came home too tired to cry, too exhausted to dream. And yet, every time I looked at Michaela and Josiah, I told myself it was worth it. That something better was coming. That somehow, somewhere, justice still lived. The cruel irony was that Kwame had always said his family loved me. That if anything happened, they'd take care of me. But love like that was thin, paper thin. It tore with the slightest pressure. They had taken our memories, our safety, our name. But what they didn't know was that in stripping me of everything, they had also peeled away every layer of fear I had ever carried. I was no longer afraid to lose. I had already lost it all. So I started writing. Every night, after the kids were asleep, I wrote down every transaction I remembered, every signature I had seen Evelyn forge, every lie they told at the funeral. I kept a box beneath the sink where I stored the receipts, the scraps of evidence. I didn't know exactly what I was building, but I knew it wasn't for nothing. One evening, after finishing my shift at a downtown hotel, I walked into a small restaurant for some leftover soup they offered the night cleaners. And that's when I met him. He wasn't like the others. He didn't pity me, didn't offer fake smiles or empty sympathy. He simply asked, "Are you okay?" And when I hesitated, when I lied and said, "Yes," he replied, "That's not what your eyes say." I didn't know then how much that one conversation would change my life. But it did. And soon I would realize that everything the Nyarko family took from me, my home, my name, my place, they had only borrowed it. Because I was coming back. And I wouldn't come alone. Rock bottom wasn't a loud crash. It was a whisper that came at night when the world was silent and your children asked questions you couldn't answer. "Mommy, why don't we go home anymore?" Josiah had asked, holding on to the tattered teddy bear his father gave him on his last birthday. Michaela stared at the ceiling instead of looking at me, pretending she wasn't crying. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because how do you tell your children that everything familiar was stolen from them, not by strangers, but by the very people who claimed to be their blood? The room we lived in was barely wide enough for the three of us to sleep side by side. The mattress was sunken in the middle, and the tap outside only worked after midnight when the pressure was low enough to let water through. I heated the water with an old kettle I found at a thrift store. Most nights, I soaked my feet in it and stared at the wall, hoping the warmth would melt the growing cold in my chest. At school, I smiled. I greeted my fellow teachers like everything was fine. They didn't know I now walked to work because I couldn't afford bus fare every day. They didn't know I sometimes ate from the children's leftovers in the lunchroom or that I used one bar of soap for both dishes and bathing. I lived two lives. One where I was managing and another where I was crumbling quietly behind closed doors. I thought the worst had already happened. I was wrong. One afternoon, I got a call from Michaela's school. She had collapsed during PE. I ran all the way there, arriving with blistered feet and trembling hands. The nurse said it was dehydration. I'd been watering down our meals, rationing fruit juice, stretching every last coin. My baby had passed out in front of her classmates because I didn't have enough to give her. That night, I sat in the bathroom and cried harder than I ever had in my life. Not because I was weak, but because I felt like I had failed my children. But rock bottom, I soon realized, had a floor. And on that floor, sometimes, you meet people who don't look down on you. That was the night I met Kweku again. He was sitting at the same counter in the back of the restaurant, reading from a small leather notebook while sipping tea. I hadn't planned to speak to him, but when the manager handed me a cold bowl of stew and told me I could eat out back, I passed by his table. He looked up and said, "Rough day." I don't know why, but I sat down. Maybe it was the way his eyes didn't flinch when he looked at me, or how his voice was steady, like an anchor. I told him I'd seen worse days.
He didn't laugh.
He simply nodded. Then he said, "People who've seen worse tend to survive the worst." And for the first time in months, I felt something I thought I'd buried. Hope. He asked about my work, and I told him. I even mentioned the second job at the cleaning agency. He didn't offer to help, and I respected that. He just listened. That night, before I left, he handed me his card. Not to impress me, but in case, he said, I ever needed someone to talk to who didn't come with pity attached. I didn't call him right away. But over the next few weeks, I kept bumping into him at the same restaurant, at the corner shop where I picked up discount bread, and once, oddly enough, outside Michaela's school. He told me later he had a niece who attended there, but I still wondered if fate had decided to throw us together. Eventually, I let him in just a little. I told him about Kwame, about the funeral, about Evelyn and the house. He didn't ask questions, but I could tell his mind was ticking. One evening, as we walked through the market together, he said, "Your husband ever sign a property trust or will?" I nodded slowly. He said he did. I never saw it, though. His mother took all the documents. That's when his expression changed. Kweku wasn't just a businessman. He was a quiet storm. Over the next few days, he helped me dig. He showed me how to request records through the courts, how to file for copies of property transfers, how to speak to certain legal aid offices that offered help to widows like me. And when I hesitated, worried I couldn't afford it, he told me not to worry about the money. He had contacts, and more importantly, he had time. The more we searched, the more the pieces fell into place. Kwame had, in fact, left something for us. A small land investment in the Volta region. A savings account set aside in my name, locked by a clause in a will. And perhaps most shocking of all, he had filed a postmarital trust naming me the sole guardian and beneficiary of all his assets. But none of it had been executed.
Why?
Because Evelyn had intercepted the process. She had convinced the executor that I was unfit and claimed the family would manage things while I was in mourning. I stared at the papers Kweku helped uncover like they were from a dream. It wasn't just about property, it was about truth. About justice. About reclaiming the life that was stolen from me and my children by people who had smiled in my face while plotting behind my back. "You still want to fight?" Kweku asked one night, as we sat outside my room, the kids finally asleep. I looked at him, not with tears, but with steel in my voice. "I don't want to fight," I said. "I want to win." And from that moment forward, I stopped being the widow everyone pitied and became the woman they would one day remember. Not for what I lost, but for what I took back. There's something powerful about being seen, really seen, not for your pain or your struggle, but for your strength when you don't even recognize it in yourself. Kweku didn't try to fix me. He didn't offer grand promises or throw money at my wounds. He simply showed up, again and again, with calm, with questions that made me think, and with actions that told me, "You are not alone anymore." And slowly, I began to stand straighter, speak louder, and feel like the woman I used to be, before the Nyarko name became a curse. He started visiting more often, always bringing something for the kids. Nothing flashy, just little thoughtful things. A new backpack for Josiah when his zipper broke. A secondhand storybook for Michaela that he remembered reading as a boy. The first time he stayed for dinner, I panicked, ashamed of the small portions I could offer. But he sat at that tiny table like it was a palace feast and thanked me like I had just served gold. My children warmed to him quickly. Josiah called him Uncle K. Michaela, always more guarded, observed him for weeks before finally opening up. One evening, she asked him about his scar. A long one that ran from his wrist up toward his elbow. He smiled and said, "It reminds me not to trust silence when something feels wrong." I never asked for the full story, but I knew he carried pain too, and maybe that's why he understood mine. With Kweku's help, I began gathering the tools I needed to confront the very people who thought they had erased me. We visited the local probate registry. He taught me how to write formal requests, how to dig through legal files, and how to identify forged signatures. He had contacts, former legal clerks, notaries, even a retired judge who agreed to review the documents Kwame's mother had used to freeze me out. And what we found was damning. Kwame's will had been tampered with. The version submitted to the courts was edited. Entire paragraphs removed, including the part that clearly stated I was to remain in the family house for the duration of our children's education. Not only that, but the land deed to the Volta property had been transferred illegally, using my late husband's forged signature months after his death. Evelyn and her sons had orchestrated the fraud together, transferring assets and draining accounts under the guise of family protection. I remember the day Kweku spread all the documents across the small table in our room. The kids were asleep, and I stared at the proof in front of me with trembling hands. "You were right," I whispered. "They stole everything." "No," he said, locking eyes with me. "They borrowed it. And now we're going to take it all back with interest." What followed were weeks of filing claims, collecting affidavits, and submitting reports to the Lands Commission and the Attorney General's office. We stayed quiet. I didn't post anything online. I didn't call or confront anyone. Silence became my sword. Because people like Evelyn only understood strength when it came wrapped in silence and served in court envelopes. The day I received a call from the estate magistrate's office, I was sweeping the compound of my night job. The officer said my petition had been accepted for review and that I had a strong case. I thanked him, hung up, and sat on the concrete ground, too overwhelmed to cry. Kweku arrived 20 minutes later with a flask of tea. I told him the news, and he smiled, not like someone who was surprised, but like someone who knew all along this moment would come. "Now," he said, "it's time to let them know." We drafted a letter together, simple, legal, and devastating. A formal notice of asset claim, backed by supporting documents and delivered by bailiff to the Nyarko family home. When Evelyn received it, she called me 9 times in a single hour. I didn't answer. She sent texts pleading, then threatening, then begging again. I said nothing, because by then, I had learned that silence could be the loudest weapon. The first court hearing was scheduled for the following month. Kweku hired a junior lawyer from his firm to represent me, an intelligent young woman who treated me with respect, not pity. The kids stayed with a neighbor, and I walked into that courtroom in a dress I hadn't worn since my wedding anniversary dinner, my head high, my heart steady. Evelyn was there, of course, dressed in expensive lace, flanked by her 2 sons. But the moment she saw the judge reading the unedited version of Kwame's will, the one she thought was destroyed, her face changed. Her sons whispered furiously, pointing fingers at each other, but it was too late. The court had the truth now. Outside the courtroom, Kweku looked at me and said, "This is only the beginning." He was right. The road ahead was still long. There would be appeals, more hearings, more days of doubt. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a widow begging for justice. I felt like a woman reclaiming what was rightfully hers. And as Kweku held my hand for the first time, not in comfort, but in solidarity, I knew one thing for certain. I may have been broken once, but the woman I had become, she was unstoppable. The day I returned to the Nyarko estate, I wore the same black heels I had worn to Kwame's funeral. Not because I was mourning anymore, but because I wanted the ground beneath me to remember who it had crushed. There's something poetic about returning to a place that tried to erase you. You don't walk in with noise or fury. You walk in with proof, with power, with silence so sharp, it slices deeper than any scream ever could. I didn't tell Kweku I was nervous, but he could see it. He held my hand in the car, didn't say much. He knew this wasn't just about property. This was about dignity. About standing in the very same courtyard where I was once dismissed like an unwanted stray and letting them see, without a word, that I had returned, not as the poor widow they discarded, but as the rightful owner with the law on her side. The gates opened when the bailiff presented the order. Evelyn stood at the doorway, arms crossed, her face tight with disbelief. Her sons lingered behind her, whispering among themselves like cornered thieves. The house was no longer theirs to command. The court order was clear. Possession was to be handed over to me within 72 hours. But I wanted no delay. So I brought the press. Yes, the press. One of Kweku's contacts worked with a local paper. I didn't want revenge through shouting. I wanted exposure. A woman thrown out with her children by her husband's family, now reclaiming her stolen inheritance? That kind of story had legs. That kind of story would follow them wherever they went, haunting their reputations in ways money couldn't fix. Evelyn tried to pretend. She said she was shocked by the court's misunderstanding. She called it a mistake, a miscommunication, even had the gall to say she was only protecting the family legacy. But when the journalist asked why her name appeared on fraudulent documents and illegal land transfers, she folded quickly. The shame on her face wasn't grief, it was fear. Because people like her didn't fear judgment from heaven. They feared disgrace among the living. The house hadn't changed much since we left. Same mahogany doors, same framed portraits in the hallway, same dusty piano I used to play lullabies on. Only this time, everything felt different. Every wall echoed differently. I no longer felt like a guest. I was home. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was mine. Because I fought for it, bled for it, and came back for it when no one thought I could. I didn't scream. I didn't rub their faces in it. I simply walked to the living room, took out the original house deed, and placed it gently on the coffee table, next to the eviction notice the court had served them. They had 48 hours to vacate. And for every hour past the deadline, they'd face legal penalties. Civil suits were already filed. Their accounts would be audited. I was no longer afraid of them. If anything, they should have feared the silence I now carried. Kweku stayed with me that night. Not because I needed protection, but because he understood the weight of it all. He cooked dinner with the kids in the same kitchen where I was once told I wasn't allowed to use family pots. We laughed. We danced to old high life songs, and for the first time in years, we slept under a roof that didn't carry betrayal in its beams. By the second day, Evelyn and her sons were gone. They left behind expensive china, a broken legacy, and their pride. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't apologize.
But I didn't need them to.
Their absence was apology enough. I used the following weeks to clean the place top to bottom. Not just the dust and grime, but the memories. I took down the old family photos, replaced them with pictures of Michaela and Josiah smiling in school uniforms Kweku had helped pay for. I turned the cold guest room into a study space. The garden, once wilted and forgotten, bloomed again under my care. And every morning, as sunlight poured through the front windows, I would stand with a cup of tea and remind myself I survived.
No, y con cara.
People started noticing. The same neighbors who had turned their faces away after the funeral now stopped to wave, to smile, even to apologize. One elderly woman came to my gate and said, "We didn't know what they did to you. We thought you had left on your own." I didn't answer. She didn't deserve my story. But her words stayed with me, not because they brought comfort, but because they reminded me how easy it is for people to ignore injustice when it doesn't touch them. A week later, a formal letter arrived. The Nyarko family was offering to settle. They wanted to avoid further legal action, claiming they were misguided by grief. I smiled as I folded the paper, not out of satisfaction, but out of recognition. They weren't sorry for what they did. They were sorry I didn't stay broken. I handed the letter to my lawyer and said, "Decline it. We go all the way." Because I wasn't just doing this for myself anymore. I was doing it for every woman who had been cast aside after her husband's death, every child who had slept hungry because of greed in disguise, every widow who had been told, "You're nothing without him." I wanted the courts, the press, and society to know we are not invisible. And through it all, Kweku stood by me, not as my savior, but as my equal. We had grown into something steady, something gentle. One night, as the children slept and we walked through the garden, he looked at me and said, "You know, I didn't come into your life to fix anything." "I know," I whispered, "but somehow you helped me rebuild everything." And he smiled, not the kind of smile you give when something ends, but the kind you wear when something new has just begun. The morning after Evelyn and her sons finally left the estate, I sat on the front steps with a steaming cup of cocoa in my hands and watched Josiah chase a butterfly across the lawn. Michaela stood at the gate, backpack on, her hair neatly braided and tied with blue ribbons, her uniform no longer faded or torn. She smiled genuinely, and in that moment I knew everything I had endured. Every night I had slept with fear instead of a blanket, every insult, every tear, every silence. It was all worth it. My children had their home back. And more than that, they had their mother back, whole and unafraid. I didn't just want them to have a roof over their heads. I wanted them to grow in a space that affirmed them. I wanted them to know dignity not as something they fought for, but something they wore like skin. And so I made plans, not grand ones, not the kind that required gold and diamonds, but plans that built a future brick by brick. The first was transforming the old guest wing of the house into a learning center. Books, computers, whiteboards, tools for the curious minds they were growing into. Kweku called it a mini library. I called it redemption, because once I had hidden Michaela's tears behind broken books and Josiah's hunger behind bedtime stories. Now they had space to dream, not just survive. Kweku was still by my side, always steady, never loud. One afternoon, he brought over a contractor. We sat with architectural sketches spread across the dining table, the same table Evelyn once refused to let me serve guests at. We mapped out a community space, a place where widows and single mothers could come, get counseling, learn basic skills, even get legal advice. I wanted to use my story, not for pity, but as a torch. One that would light the way for women like me, those tossed aside and told they had no right to rise. "You've turned pain into power," Kweku said, looking at the plans. "And that's something no one can steal from you." I smiled, but inside, I still carried the weight of what had been done to us. There was a scar inside me, one not even time could erase. But I wasn't ashamed of it, because that scar reminded me why I would never stop pushing forward. I had been given a second chance, and my children, they would never have to endure what I had survived. That evening, Michaela brought home a drawing. She had sketched our family, me, Josiah, herself, and Kweku. She had drawn us standing in front of the estate, with smiles on our faces and sunlight above our heads. At the top, she had written, "My real family." I stared at that paper for a long time, my eyes stinging, not because of sadness, but because my daughter finally felt safe enough to believe in happiness again. There were still court dates ahead, of course. Evelyn and her sons were attempting to delay the financial audits. But my lawyer, bless her persistent, brilliant soul, was prepared for every twist. The press still followed the case, and public sympathy had overwhelmingly turned in my favor. I wasn't just the forgotten widow anymore. I was the woman who fought back and won. One night, I found Josiah kneeling beside his bed, praying in that soft, mumbling way little boys do when they're half asleep. I stood quietly at the door and listened. He said, "Thank you, God, for a home. And please don't let Grandma, Evelyn, come back." I closed my eyes and leaned against the wall. He was too young to understand legal settlements, but he understood something more primal, safety. And he knew now that we had it back. The next morning, I made a decision. I visited the headmaster of Michaela's and Josiah's school and offered to sponsor a fund for students who had lost a parent. It wouldn't be much at first, just books, uniforms, exam fees, but I knew what that could mean for a grieving child and a desperate parent. When the headmaster asked why I was doing it, I told him, because no one should have to choose between burial and survival. Because I know what it feels like to bury someone and lose your life in the same week. Words spread quickly. Women started visiting me. Some came with questions. Others came with pain in their eyes. I listened. I shared my story, not for drama, but for truth. I told them that justice isn't always fast, but it's worth chasing. I told them that silence is not always weakness. Sometimes, silence is how you sharpen your resolve. Kweku and I grew closer through it all. We never rushed anything. We didn't need to. Love, when it's born from fire, doesn't come dressed in fairy tale. It comes wrapped in resilience. We began planning a future together, not to replace Kwame, but to honor what we had both lost and what we had found. A second chapter. A peaceful one. The kids started calling him Uncle K more openly, with comfort and ease. Josiah even asked once if he could live here forever. Kweku laughed and said, "Only if your mom wants me to." I didn't respond then, but I smiled. A real, grounded, grateful smile. Because this house, once filled with betrayal and silence, was now a home again. Not because the furniture was fancy, not because the walls had been repainted, but because laughter had returned. Because the kitchen smelled of dinner again, not tension. Because bedtime came with peace, not worry. And because I had finally understood something, I wasn't just rebuilding my life for my children. I was rebuilding the world they would inherit. And I would stop at nothing to make sure it was one where they knew their worth, their strength, and their mother's name, not as the woman who was cast out, but as the woman who came back stronger than anyone imagined. There are moments in life that feel like endings, heavy, dark, and absolute. I've lived through one of those. But what no one ever tells you is that some endings are actually just the beginning of a version of you that you never imagined you could become. The day I stood on that stage, staring out into a sea of women, many with their heads down, others clinging to hope, I finally understood what this journey had been about. Not revenge, not even justice. It had been about rediscovery, rebirth. I was no longer the woman who stood by the coffin. unsure of where her life would go next. I was no longer the woman who begged quietly for dignity or walked silently through pain, afraid to disturb the world with her suffering. That woman had died the same day my husband did. In her place now stood someone else. Someone who had walked through fire and come out lit from within. I had been invited to speak at the Widows' Advocacy Conference in Accra. Me? A woman who once scrubbed toilets in silence, who begged a landlord for a few more days, who had gone hungry to feed her children. Now I stood before others, not to boast, but to testify. I shared my story plainly. I told them how my husband died, and how the family I thought was mine stripped me of everything within days. I told them how I left the house with 2 children, 2 bags, and no plan. And then I told them what I did with all that pain. I told them about the late nights cleaning offices while my children slept. I told them about the man who didn't try to rescue me, but helped me remember how to rescue myself. I told them about the documents, the court hearings, the silence that fought louder than screams ever could. And I told them that I didn't just win back my house. I won back my voice. When I said, "You don't need to scream to be powerful. You just need to stop whispering your worth," there was silence in the room. And then a wave of applause. But more than that, I saw tears. Not because my story was sad, but because it was familiar. After the conference, women lined up to speak with me. Some were widows, some divorcees, some mothers abandoned by tradition and greed. They held my hands, shared their own truths. And for each one, I offered the only thing that ever helped me: a listening ear and the strength to remind them they were not alone. I didn't return home that night with flowers or trophies. I returned home to Josiah fast asleep with a book on his chest and Michaela sitting at the kitchen table, working on a school project about inspirational women. She had printed out a photo of me and glued it beside Harriet Tubman and Yaa Santua. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but I knelt beside her and said, "What made you choose me?" She shrugged and said, "Because you fought for us. And you never stopped." Kweku came in just after that with dinner. He had learned how to cook our favorite jollof rice exactly the way Kwame used to, and I knew that wasn't by accident. He had honored my past, not erased it. That night, as we ate and laughed, he asked me gently if I'd ever consider starting a foundation. "You already have the voice," he said. "Why not use it to build something permanent?" And so I did. We named it the Widowed Strong Foundation. We started small, offering legal counseling, therapy referrals, small grants. But it grew faster than I expected. People wanted to help. Women volunteered. Lawyers stepped up. Donations trickled in. The estate, once a symbol of my suffering, became our headquarters. And every child who ran through those halls, every woman who sat in our chairs, every tear that fell inside those walls, it reminded me that healing is never wasted. Evelyn and her sons never recovered publicly. Their businesses faltered. Their social standing shrank. But I didn't dance over their downfall. I didn't need to, because my victory wasn't in watching them fall. My victory was in seeing my children rise. Josiah joined a robotics club. Michaela was elected class president. They carried no bitterness, no hatred, just strength. The kind you pass down not in words, but in the way you survive, the way you live with your head high even when the world tries to keep you on your knees. Sometimes at night, I still think of Kwame. I still miss him. He was a good man caught between love and family tradition. I don't know what he would have said if he'd seen what his family did. But I know this. He would have been proud of the woman I became. Not the woman who waited to be saved, but the woman who became her own salvation. One Sunday evening, I stood alone in the garden. The air was calm, the sun melting over the horizon. I whispered to myself, "You did it." Not loudly, Not for anyone else. Just for me. For the girl who once sat in a broken room with two hungry children, praying to survive one more day. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't just the woman who reclaimed her home. I wasn't just the mother who refused to let her children drown in despair. I was the fire they tried to extinguish and failed. And I had become everything they said I could never be. Thank you for listening to this powerful story of strength, betrayal, and redemption. If this story moved you or reminded you of your own journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. More true-to-life stories of resilience and justice are coming your way, so stay tuned and remember, sometimes the quietest fight is the most powerful victory.